Hi, listeners, and welcome. I'm doing something a little different this week. 6 years ago, during the pandemic, I took the leap and decided to start my own true crime podcast. For this week's episode, I thought I'd share with you what life is like as a true crime podcaster, how the show has changed and evolved over the years, and other projects I'm working on. Let's get started. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 179, 6 Years of Podcasting. Before I began podcasting, I'd been working mostly in the publishing world as a freelance writer and magazine editor for various regional magazines in the Charlotte area. But I've always been drawn to true crime, and the advent of podcasts gave me the opportunity to learn more about cases I wasn't familiar with and a new way to consume the genre other than watching true crime shows on television or reading nonfiction books. If you've been with me from the very beginning, you've heard about the contest that motivated me to fully flesh out my idea for a podcast. But since I have a lot of new listeners, I'll give an overview of that story again. In 2019, our local public radio station held a contest looking for new podcast ideas. I thought this might be a good opportunity to get my idea in front of people who could help me develop it. I outlined the episode format I wanted to use, my target demographics, a bio, and a podcast title and cover art. I was pumped for the opportunity. Then, reality hit. The way this particular contest was being run, I had to ask acquaintances to vote for my podcast idea on Facebook each day for a few weeks. And anyone who wanted to enter the podcast was allowed to do so, leaving more than 200 podcast concepts in the running. Furthermore, some podcast ideas were backed by large businesses and other organizations, so they utilized their email lists and social media fans to encourage the voting every day. My podcast quickly fell out of the running, and I'll admit I was pretty discouraged by the experience. But little by little, the idea to create the podcast on my own stayed with me. I began listening to podcasts that featured interviews with podcasters so I could learn more about the technical components. One of these interviews provided a podcast checklist, which I still have pinned to the bulletin board in my office. Slowly, I checked things off my list. I didn't have a lot of money to invest in my initial venture, so I researched ways to podcast on a budget. Believe it or not, it is possible. I already had recording software on my computer. I purchased a good microphone and a set of headphones. I put together a general format as a solo podcast with no co-host and began compiling a list of missing persons cases. Eventually, the podcast segued into a missing persons and cold case and true crime podcast, which you now listen to today. Then I had to spend time learning how to create an RSS feed, select a podcast host, and figure out how to embed the RSS feed into all the different podcasting platforms. I officially launched the podcast on May 1st, 2020. At first, because I had a lot of time on my hands, I produced weekly episodes, but I found myself working a lot between the day job I had at the time and researching and writing the episodes. I quickly reached burnout. I dialed back production and dropped bi-weekly episodes for a while. I've grown this podcast community organically, mostly through social media channels and word of mouth. Besides a few paid ads on Facebook, I've never invested in any advertising, only participated in promo swaps with other podcasters. I've taught true crime podcasting and writing webinars through a website called Wow Women on Writing. Today, I'm going to share what I've learned over 6 years of podcasting. First, I want to talk about the importance of consistency. There were a few times during the early years of this podcast where I would take periodic breaks, a couple of weeks up to a couple of months. I knew I needed to do this for my own mental and physical health, as this podcast has never been a profitable venture for me. I produced this podcast on a bare bones budget that includes recording and video software, a website, and the occasional freelance help. I now have a volunteer helping me with social media, and that has worked wonders for engagement, along with finally getting on TikTok. Now, I admit I'm responsible for this podcast not making money. I own that. I consider myself more of a creative and not a business person, so I haven't invested the money I need to scale the podcast. After 6 years, I'm almost at the point where I feel ready to do that. I'm just about eligible for monetization on Spotify, and that has been a big step. One I wasn't sure I would ever achieve because my podcast is so niche. But when you're building a platform, consistency and showing up is important. Eventually, I went back to a weekly podcast schedule. But because I now have more than 150 episodes in the can, showing up once a week isn't as difficult as it once was. This leads me to the second thing I want to talk about: repurposing content within the episodes. I can run replays and repurpose older episodes to help round out the schedule. I've been doing that for the past year, and so far I've had no complaints from listeners about it. Plus, I can include any updates on cases on those repackaged episodes. I believe new listeners are finding the podcast every month, so this is a good way to introduce them to the show catalog in case they don't want to start from the very beginning. And to be honest, when people tell me they're starting from the very beginning, I cringe a little bit because I truly didn't know what I was doing when I started this podcast. I believe it's important for every piece of content I create to be shared multiple places. I format a post for each episode on the show website, missinginthecarolinas.com. I pull stories from the podcast to share on my writing website, finishedpages.com. I've used research from the podcast in various essays I've written and published. True crime has also inspired short stories I've written. And of course, details and video content from each episode is shared across my social media channels: Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. I mentioned before that for the most part, I've grown this podcast community organically. For anyone who is a regular listener who shares this podcast with your friends, family, and anyone who enjoys true crime shows, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I also must thank other true crime podcasters who have reached out for promo swaps, interviews, collaborations, and other mutually beneficial projects. We can't create in a vacuum, and I love meeting other authors and creators who nerd out on true crime and are eager to make a difference in the community just as much as I do. I'm proud to tell people that I've been credited as a source for 2 different North Carolina true crime books. I consider that one of the highest compliments I could ever receive. So what does a day in the life of a part-time true podcaster look like? Well, that varies depending on the day. I have other jobs, for one thing. I work in a local independent bookstore part-time, and that job fills my soul and helps me meet new people. I write fiction and nonfiction. In fact, I'm compiling a regional true crime book based on my research for this podcast. I also freelance for Wow Women on Writing, so my days are busy and never look the same. I love that. In response to the question of whether I have a podcast studio, I don't. I never have. This has led to some negative reviews in the past year. I work out of one room in my house, and that works for me because it is low overhead. I've seen negative reviews about the quality of my audio production, and to that I say, I'm doing my best. To set up the kind of podcast studio you see professional podcasters and YouTubers have can run you thousands of dollars a month. And as an independent podcaster without any large show sponsors, I can't afford to take on that kind of cost. I've been trying out a new audio service, and I have to say I've grown a little bit disillusioned with it. It uses AI to help edit the audio, and lately it has caused more work to correct the mistakes it introduces. The AI has been cutting off my words, not allowing me to restore the cuts, and takes out any pauses over 2 seconds. I firmly believe it's trying to make me sound like a robot, and I am fully 100% human. So I'm working on fixing that, as well as how to take out the echo in the audio that I've seen some reviews post about. To any listeners who feel the need to drop a negative review after listening to one episode, and that could very well be from my early shows where the audio was much different, I ask that you give this podcaster grace. I put a lot of work into creating a good show, but I also don't feel like I shouldn't be allowed to produce a podcast if I don't have all the bells and whistles someone like, say, Mel Robbins has. Believe me, I've heard much worse audio quality in other shows than mine, and they are backed by large corporate sponsors. So again, I'm doing my best with this show that I'm paying money out of my own pocket to produce. Before we continue, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. Skincare shouldn't be complicated. Clean doesn't mean weak. Those are the words of Erin Sanderson, creator of the SkinX Erin products offered by Midnight Riff. She describes the line as born from obsession and built for results. I love Erin Sanderson's skincare line so much, I became an ambassador so I could earn a small commission off telling everyone just how much I appreciate the Pre-Cleanse Oil, Hydrating Beauty Oil, and Perfecting Night Oil. My skin is acne-free, even in the throes of perimenopause, and looking brighter and more youthful than ever. On average, the oils last around 3 months, and despite their names, they won't make your skin oily. Try them out for yourself with my code MissingCarolinas10 for 10% off your order. I've been struggling with my weight for years, especially once I hit my 40s and the dreaded perimenopause. As my weight continued to increase, I made excuse after excuse. I work out all the time. I get in my steps every day. I eat healthy most of the time. Well, most of the time wasn't cutting it. I'd had success with Weight Watchers in the past and decided to give it a try again. I quickly learned it was the mindless snacking I was doing in the evenings that was contributing to my weight gain. Weight Watchers makes it easy to track foods and meals on their app, and they have numerous plans designed to fit your needs, whether you're just looking to learn more about nutrition, lose a few pounds, or embark on a program that includes GLP-1 options. I've been doing their core program for 2 months and have taken advantage of all the 0-point foods like eggs, Greek yogurt, turkey, chicken, fresh vegetables, and more. I love that the app also helps you track your macros, which is something it didn't include in the past, and provides quick and easy recipes. I've been on the program for more than 2 months now and have lost 10 pounds. I'm almost to my goal weight now and feeling fantastic. Weight Watchers doesn't tell you what to eat, they tell you how to eat, and I never feel restricted. I eat what I love, and you should too. Check out my referral link in the show notes for your chance to receive your first 3 months free with select plan purchase, not valid for WW Med Plus plans and services. And now, let's get back to the show. Since we're taking a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, I thought you might be interested in learning about some of the unusual and mysterious emails and comments I get on my blog. This is where things get tricky sometimes because I have to discern which emails are legitimate, which are phishing emails, and which are sent from people who have maybe taken the armchair detective thing a little too far. I also must protect myself and my family. I think I've also mentioned in the past that I try to be sensitive when writing and researching cases for my podcast, because in many instances, the people I'm podcasting or sharing about are still alive or have family members that could be listening. In my early days of podcasting, I shared the story of Sherry Hart, who was murdered by a man named Richard Bear in Wilkes County in 1984. Richard Bear was arrested along with Jeffrey Burgess for the murder of Sherry Hart, but Richard walked out of the Wilkes County Jail on July 17, 1985 and promptly disappeared. He has never been captured. This case has a lot of mysterious components because people in the community claimed Richard Bear would return to the area periodically, in disguise, to visit with family members. Well, a few years ago, someone claiming that Richard Bear was their uncle emailed me and offered to share information. I was still in the early days of my podcasting and excited to get a lead. I corresponded with this person who had a throwaway email, even giving them my phone number so they could call me. This person said they didn't know where Richard was, but insinuated he was still alive. They said they wanted to help put him away. I never received any other calls or emails from this person. When I posted the story on my blog, a person calling themselves Richard Bear posted, "This isn't what happened at all." Another person named Ash asked for the tip line in that case. Another concerning thing that's happened is a person claiming to be Jeremy Grice, who went missing from South Carolina on November 22, 1985, posting on my blog. The person posted several confusing comments claiming to be the missing boy, mentioned scars on his genitalia, and spammed the comments with misspellings and typos until I had to block him. After doing a little research, I discovered this person has claimed to be Jeremy all over the internet, and the majority of people who have seen his comments believe him to be mentally ill and likely not Jeremy Grice. But you can imagine what runs through your head when you first receive a message to that effect. Recently, I received a message from what looks like a throwaway email account called Concerned Duramite, really late on a Saturday night. The person wanted to discuss the Cynthia Kirk cold case, which I covered in episode 152. If you'll recall, Cindy Kirk was murdered in her driveway while her daughter slept inside the house. And although neighbors and people working in the neighborhood that day helped police put together a composite sketch of the suspect, her killer was never caught. This throwaway email account is convinced the composite looks like Michael Peterson, who you'll recall spent time in prison for the murder of his wife Kathleen before being released in 2017. Now, this person who said they lived in Durham as a child and vividly remember when Cynthia was murdered gave me their phone number. They had put together a timeline of why they believe Michael Peterson to be a viable suspect in Cynthia's murder, including the resemblance in the composite sketches that I mentioned. Now, you might be wondering why I did not immediately give this person a call. First of all, in cold cases, I always leave the number of the established tip line in the episode or blog post. I'm thinking this person came across Cynthia's case on my blog. I have to be very careful about who I give my number to, for reasons I'm sure you understand. I've also never wanted to be one of those podcasters who engage in theories that I have no physical evidence to support. Nevertheless, I'm intrigued. This person put together some interesting points in their email, but I'm still hesitant to engage in this type of speculation. One of the podcast episodes that generated the most attention, at least on my blog, was the murder of Pamela Mitchell Hoy. I shared her unsolved case in episode 102 of the podcast, and I was surprised to see so many comments on the post when I shared it on my blog. People who claimed to have known Pam and believed her husband, Fred Hoy, to be responsible for her death chimed in. One of her daughters disputed those claims. Someone else remembered Fred Hoy using corporal punishment on students regularly when he was a teacher in Burlington. I won't read all the comments aloud here, but if you're interested, you can go to finishedpages.com and search Pam Hoy's name to see the post and discussion that followed. One of the things I'm most proud of is bringing awareness to cases that don't have much of a digital footprint. Last week's episode on Cora Lee Hamby from Statesville is just one of those. If you haven't listened to it yet, I encourage you to go check it out. When I first learned about her case, I couldn't find any information online or on any other podcasts. But all these years later, Cora's case was never solved, despite police targeting a prime suspect from the very beginning. I've never wanted this podcast to regurgitate things online or facts shared on other podcasts. This is why I put a lot of thought into what cases I cover. One of my goals for this year is to improve my investigative skills, and I have a plan in place to do that. Listener tips are very helpful in that regard, but sometimes they are just a starting point. But still, I do love receiving messages from listeners. I just get wary of the throwaway accounts that promise to break a case wide open. I know I still have room to grow. I want to make this show the best possible podcast it can be, and I'm slowly but surely taking steps to ensure that happens. Whether you've been with me from the very beginning or are a new listener, I appreciate each and every download. Thank you. This brings us to the conclusion of this mini episode of Missing in the Carolinas. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people and true crimes profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. All episodes are researched and written by me, Renee Robertson, with sound editing provided by Daniel Robertson. Jenna Browse is the social media coordinator and research assistant. Thanks so much for listening.